They called her fat. They called her foolish. They called her nothing. In the frontier town of Red Hollow, a woman named Rosalie Boone walked through the same streets as everyone else. But she walked alone, always alone, while wealthy widows in silk dresses laughed behind gloved hands, and ranch owners looked straight through her like she was part of the fence post. Then one man stopped looking through her, and that single moment cracked this town wide open. What happened next, nobody saw coming. If you're watching right now, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's begin. The trouble with Red Hollow was that it had never learned the difference between a person and a problem. It was a hard town by any measure, dust-choked in summer, brutal cold by October, and sitting at the edge of the Wyoming high plains like something the rest of the world had lost interest in finishing. The buildings along the main street had a leaning quality to them, like men who'd been standing too long in wind. The church steeple had been threatening to come down for 3 years. The livery smelled of rot and old hay. Everything in Red Hollow had a worn-down, half-finished feeling, and the people who lived there had mostly absorbed that quality into themselves without noticing. But what Red Hollow lacked in softness, it made up for in opinions. And its most firmly held opinion, on the morning that everything began to shift, was that Rosalie Boone had no business being anywhere near Caleb Mercer. Rosalie had lived in Red Hollow for 6 years, and in those 6 years she had developed a precise understanding of how invisible a person could be while still taking up physical space in the world. She ran a small alteration shop on the east side of the main street, tucked between a hardware store and a building that couldn't decide what it was from month to month. The shop was tidy. She kept it that way out of stubbornness more than pride, because she'd learned early that women who looked like her weren't allowed the same slack as other people. A pretty woman could have a messy storefront and people would find it charming. Rosalie kept her windows clean and her signs straight and her ledger balanced to the penny, and people still found reasons to talk. She was a big woman. That was the fact the town had decided to organize itself around when it came to Rosalie Boone. Not the fact that she'd taught herself surveying from a borrowed textbook. Not the fact that she could stretch a dollar further than anyone in the county. Not the fact that she had a memory like a steel trap and had once talked a supply merchant down from highway robbery prices by citing 3 competing freight routes he hadn't known she knew about. No. What Red Hollow had decided about Rosalie was simpler than any of that. She was fat, she was plain, and she'd come from somewhere else. Those 3 things were more than enough. Yet, the morning in question was a Thursday in early June, and the heat was already gathering itself into something mean by 7 o'clock. Rosalie was outside her shop taking down the winter shutters she'd left up too long. She'd been putting it off because the upper hinge on the left side had stripped, and she needed a proper tool, not the butter knife she'd been working with, when she heard the sound of boots on the boardwalk behind her, and turned to find Mabel Crane standing there with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mabel Crane was exactly the kind of woman Red Hollow approved of. She was 42, recently widowed, in possession of a cattle operation of several hundred head that her late husband had built and she had maintained with admirable efficiency. She was slim, light-haired, and wore dresses that cost more than Rosalie's monthly rent. She also had a voice that carried precisely as far as she intended it to carry, and not a single inch further, which was a skill Rosalie had reluctantly come to respect even as she distrusted everything else about the woman. "Morning, Rosalie," Mabel said, in the particular tone that meant she was about to say something she'd planned. "Morning." Rosalie went back to the shutter hinge. "You hear about the Mercer dinner last Saturday?" Rosalie hadn't been at the Mercer dinner. She hadn't been invited to the Mercer dinner, which was a social event at Caleb Mercer's ranch that half the town's eligible women had apparently attended in their best clothing with their best conversations prepared. She'd heard about it second and third hand through the week, the way she heard about most things in Red Hollow. "I heard something," she said. "He didn't ask anyone to walk out with him," Mabel said, still smiling. "After all that, can you imagine? Dolores Fitch practically wore her mother's pearls. He just thanked everyone for coming and went back inside." She paused. "Some people say he was distracted, looking toward the East Road most of the night." Rosalie didn't respond to that. She wasn't sure what response was expected. "Your shop faces the East Road," Mabel added, with the careful precision of someone placing a thumbtack on a map. Rosalie looked at her. I know where my shop faces, Mabel. Mabel's smile didn't change. Of course you do. She moved off down the boardwalk, her skirt hem clearing the dust with a sound like a broom. Rosalie stood there for a moment, butter knife still in her hand, and then turned back to the shutter. The hinge was stripped. She was going to need to rethread it entirely, which meant a trip to the hardware store, which meant talking to Hank Purvis, who would spend 20 minutes telling her she was doing it wrong before selling her what she'd asked for in the first place. She put the butter knife in her apron pocket and went inside to get her coin purse. Caleb Mercer. The town had built a particular mythology around him, the way small towns do around men who are useful and difficult in equal measure. He was 38 years old, had come into the Mercer Ranch through inheritance when he was 24, and had spent the next 14 years turning a struggling operation into one of the most functional spreads in the county. He ran about 800 head, kept 20 men on payroll through the year rather than laying them off in winter like most ranchers did, and had a reputation for paying his debts on the day they were due. No later, no earlier, as if punctuality itself were a moral position. He was also, as the town had noted with ongoing interest, unmarried. His wife Eleanor had died 4 years back. Fever, quick and unsparing. And since then the eligible women of Red Hollow and its surrounding ranches had entered into a kind of slow-moving competition for his attention that everyone pretended wasn't happening while they were clearly doing it. Mabel Crane was the presumed frontrunner. She had money, land, social standing, and the particular brand of composed attractiveness that photographed well. After her was Dolores Fitch, who had family connections to a county judge and a laugh that men seemed to find charming. After Dolores, there was a longer list that nobody had entirely organized yet. Rosalie Boone was not on any version of this list. That was simply understood. Nobody had stated it as a rule because nobody needed to. It was the kind of thing Red Hollow knew in its bones. What? She was at the hardware counter when she first actually spoke to Caleb Mercer. She'd seen him before. You couldn't live 6 years in a town and not have seen every person in it multiple times, but they'd never exchanged more than the minimal pleasantries that frontier life required when two people were moving through the same door. He was tall enough that she'd noticed that. Brown hair going gray at the temples. A quality of attention in his face that was different from most men she encountered, who tended to look at things and move on. When Caleb Mercer looked at something, he seemed to actually be thinking about it. He was at the counter ahead of her, talking to Hank Purvis about wire gauge. Rosalie waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice. The 16 gauge doesn't hold in hard freeze, Caleb was saying. Learned that the first winter. You go in thinking you've got fence, and come spring you've got suggestions. Hank laughed. Hank never laughed at anything, Rosalie said. 14 gauge? Hank offered. 14's better, but it's harder to work. Got a stretch of canyon fence that needs repair, and my best wireman quit last month. What happened to Darcy? Darcy got a better offer from the Henderson operation. A pause. Can't blame him. Rosalie waited, looking at the cans of machine oil on the shelf to her left, and then said, without entirely planning to, Canyon fence in hard rock ground needs 14 gauge, but the real problem is usually the post anchor. Wire holds fine if the post doesn't move. People fix the wire and ignore the post and wonder why it fails again in 6 months. There was a brief silence. She looked over. Both men were looking at her. Hank had his expression that meant he was preparing to be condescending. Caleb had the other thing, the actual attention pointed directly at her. That's right, Caleb said. I know it's right, she said, which wasn't the most gracious way to respond, but it came out before she could refine it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that might have been the beginning of a real smile, You do much fencing? I did 4 years on my uncle's property in Nebraska before I came here. He had a canyon section, too. Same problem, same fix, she paused. Steel plate anchor under the post, packed tight with the excavated rock. Holds through freeze-thaw cycles better than anything else I found. Caleb nodded slowly, the kind of nod that was actually processing something. Who's your uncle? Tom Boone. He ran a small operation outside Kearney, sold up and moved south a few years back. I know the name. He studied her for another moment with that direct quality she found both uncomfortable and oddly settling. I don't think we've been properly introduced. Rosalie Boone, she said. I run the alterations shop, East Side. Caleb Mercer. He extended a hand. She shook it. His grip was straightforward, not the kind of testing grip some men used on women to make a point. You're right about the anchor. I should have thought of that. He took his wire and left. Hank Purvis sold Rosalie the rethread kit she needed with slightly less commentary than usual, which was something. She didn't think much of it. That was the honest truth. She went back to her shop, fixed the shutter hinge herself in about 40 minutes. Despite Hank's prediction that she'd need professional help, took in 3 alterations jobs before noon, ate lunch alone in the back room with a surveying pamphlet she'd borrowed from the land office, and thought about the water table data she'd been looking at for the past several weeks with a growing unease she couldn't quite name yet. The drought had been coming for 2 seasons. Everyone in Red Hollow could feel it, even if they weren't saying it plainly. The winter snowpack had been thin, the creek levels were down. The grass on the eastern range was coming up sparse and pale. These were facts, and Rosalie had been quietly compiling them in a journal she kept under the counter, cross-referencing them against the old territorial survey maps she'd sweet-talked the land office clerk into letting her copy. She had a theory. She wasn't sure yet if it was a good theory or a half-baked one, but she had it. She hadn't told anyone about it. There was no one to tell. The first time Caleb came into her shop was 5 days after the hardware store encounter. He came in the late afternoon when the street outside had quieted down from its midday activity, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking around the shop with the same attentive quality he brought to everything before he said, "I have a problem I think you might be able to help with." Rosalie was at the work table, working on a dress alteration for the minister's wife. She set down her shears. "Alterations problem?" "No, survey problem." He came in and set a rolled paper on the table, a map of his ranch's southeastern range section. "My fence line in this section doesn't match the survey stakes from when the property was recorded. I need to know which is right before I sink new posts." Rosalie unrolled the map and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get this survey?" she asked. "Came with the property records, 1871. The territorial surveys from 1871 have a known error in this part of the county. The baseline was run from a reference point that was later corrected. Everything south of the Red Hollow Creek line is off by about 40 feet west." She pointed to the section in question. "Your stakes are probably right. The map is wrong." Caleb looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I've read the surveying literature. There's a paper from the Territorial Engineer's Office from 1878 that documents the correction. The land office has a copy." She paused. "Most people don't know about it because it's filed under water rights amendments, not under survey records." Another long look. "You read water rights amendments for fun?" "I read them because I was looking for something else and found it interesting." She rolled the map back. "Your fence line is probably fine. I'd verify against the 1878 correction document before you spend money on new posts." He didn't leave right away. He stood at the counter for a moment, which was unusual because men on errands in Red Hollow were not typically lingerers. "You've been here 6 years," he said. "Yes." "And before that, Nebraska?" "Yes." "What brought you here specifically?" Rosalie considered several different answers. The honest one was that she'd come to Red Hollow because it was cheap and distant, and she'd needed distance from several things she wasn't going to discuss with a man she'd spoken to twice. She settled on a version of that. "It was available," she said, "and it wasn't where I'd been." Something in his face shifted. Not pity, which she'd been braced for, but recognition, like she'd said something he understood from the inside. "Fair enough," he said. He picked up the map, paid her a consulting fee she hadn't asked for, and tried to refuse, and he wouldn't let her, and left. Seb, the town noticed. Of course it did. Elsa Dunmore, who ran the millinery shop 2 doors down and made it her business to observe the main street with the dedication of a military scout, reported to no fewer than 4 people by the end of that afternoon that Caleb Mercer had spent 14 minutes in Rosalie Boone's alteration shop with no apparent alterations business to conduct. This intelligence moved through Red Hollow with the speed of a brush fire. By the following morning, Rosalie was aware of it in the way she was always aware of being talked about. Not from what people said to her directly, which was nothing, but from the slight recalibration of how people looked at her when she walked past. The slight hesitation before turning away. The lowered conversations. Mabel Crane came into the shop that afternoon. She came in under the pretext of inquiring about a dress repair, which was transparent because Mabel Crane employed a personal seamstress and had never set foot in Rosalie's shop before. She moved around the small space looking at things, touching the bolts of fabric along the wall with her fingertips. And then she said, still looking away, "I heard Caleb came by." "He had a survey question," Rosalie said. She was threading a needle and did not look up. "A survey question." Mabel's voice was pleasant in the way a closed room is pleasant. No air. "And you helped him with it." I knew the answer. Mabel turned. "Rosalie?" The pleasantness was still there, but thinner now. "I'm going to say this as a kindness, because I've lived here 20 years and I know how things work. Caleb Mercer comes from a family with history in this county. He's going to need a partner who fits that. Who can stand next to him at land commission meetings and territorial dinners, and you understand what I'm saying?" "I understand exactly what you're saying," Rosalie said. "Then you'll also understand that this kind of thing—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them, meaning, Rosalie understood, the audacity of Rosalie's very existence in this conversation, "can only go one way, and I'd hate to see you hurt." Rosalie set down the threaded needle and looked at her. "Mabel, do you want the dress repaired or not?" A pause. The pleasant expression held for another few seconds, and then Mabel left. Rosalie picked up the needle and went back to work. Her hands were steady, because she'd taught them to be steady, but there was a pressure behind her sternum that she was very familiar with and had never entirely learned to ignore. She wasn't stupid. She understood what Mabel was doing, and she understood that Mabel wasn't entirely wrong about how the world worked. There was a version of this where Caleb Mercer had come to her shop twice on business, and that was the beginning and the end of it. There was a version where she was projecting significance onto transactions that had none. She'd learned not to put weight on things that hadn't offered to hold it yet. The drought was getting worse. She could see it in the data she'd been compiling, and she could see it with her own eyes in the cracked mud along the edge of the creek that ran behind the south end of town, and she could hear it in the tighter quality that was entering people's conversations about feed prices and water access. 3 ranches in the lower valley had already started trucking water in from the river 30 miles east. That was expensive and temporary, and everyone knew it wasn't a real solution, but no one was saying that out loud yet, because saying it out loud would require them to admit that a real solution was needed, and no one had one. Rosalie had been working on the map every night for 2 weeks. The map she'd made herself painstakingly from the combination of the 1871 Territorial Survey, the 1878 corrections, a set of geological notes from a university expedition that had passed through the region in 1882, and her own observations from rides she'd taken on her old horse Barton into the foothills east of town when she'd had free afternoons. She'd been piecing it together the way you piece together a quilt, matching edges that weren't obvious, finding patterns in the seams. What she'd found was a water channel. Old. Very old, in the sense that it had been built by someone before the current settlement and then abandoned, probably during a period of violence or exodus or simple economics that history hadn't found worth recording. It ran from the higher snowpack country in the eastern mountains down through a ravine system that had been mapped as impassable and mostly ignored by current surveyors. Parts of it had collapsed, parts were intact, but if you could clear the debris from the 2 main blockage points and reconstruct the original outlet at the valley floor, the channel could carry water to the Red Hollow Basin without requiring any of the expensive infrastructure the county commission had been arguing about for 3 years. She had calculated the grade. She had checked it twice. The math was right. The problem was the terrain. The ravine system was unstable in sections. The work would be physically dangerous, and it would require equipment and manpower she didn't have, and it would require someone to believe her enough to commit resources to it. And she was aware of exactly how likely that was given who she was in this town. She had been sitting on this information for 3 weeks, wondering what to do with it. Caleb came back to the shop on a Wednesday. He didn't have a survey question this time. He had apparently no pretext at all, because he stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, with the slight discomfort of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it, I'd like to take you to dinner Saturday evening at Hartley's, if you're willing. Rosalie looked at him. Dinner, she said. Yes. At Hartley's. It's the best restaurant in town. I mean, that's the point of suggesting it. I'm not trying to be. He stopped, exhaled once. I'm asking you to dinner. Not about a fence or a survey. Just dinner. Rosalie studied him for a long moment. Hartley's was the restaurant where the county commission held its dinners and the successful ranchers celebrated their good seasons, and the social structure of Red Hollow was on full display every Saturday evening. Caleb Mercer bringing Rosalie Boone to Hartley's on a Saturday night would be seen by approximately everyone who mattered in this town. You know what people will say, she said. Yes. You've thought about that. Yes. And? He looked at her directly. I find I don't care as much about what people say as I probably should. She was quiet for a moment. The pressure behind her sternum was doing something different now, which she didn't entirely trust. I have a business matter I'd like to discuss with you, she said. Something I've been working on for a few weeks. It relates to the water situation. You can tell me about it at dinner, he said. Not dismissively. Seriously. Like he meant it. All right, she said. He nodded. Said 7 o'clock. Left. Rosalie stood in her empty shop for a moment and then went to the back room and looked at the map spread out on the table. The channel lines she'd drawn in faint pencil, checked and rechecked. The calculations in the margin in her small, precise handwriting. She rolled it up carefully and set it against the wall. Saturday, then. But she wore her good dress, which was dark green and fit her well because she'd altered it herself. And she walked to Hartley's at 5 minutes to 7 with her map rolled and tucked under her arm because she decided to bring it and then decided not to and then decided to again. Caleb was already there, waiting outside the door. He was in a clean shirt and had made some effort with his appearance, which she noticed and which made the evening feel more real than she'd been prepared for. He looked at her and said, You look well, which was simple enough that she believed he meant it. Inside, Hartley's was warm and lamp-lit and smelled of roasting meat, and every single person in the room looked up when they walked in. Rosalie had anticipated this and had decided in advance that she would not alter her posture or her expression in response to it. She was good at holding herself still. She'd had practice. They were seated at a corner table by a window. The conversations around them resumed, quieter and reconfigured. How long have you been looking at the water problem? Caleb asked, after the first drinks had arrived and they'd both done the thing where you arrange yourself at the table and look at the menu you're not really reading. Rosalie set the menu down. 2 seasons. I started noticing the pattern in the creek levels the winter before last. Then I started pulling the old surveys. What did you find? She unrolled the map carefully on the edge of the table, smoothing it flat with one hand. She explained it to him plainly, the way she explained things, without apology or elaboration, just the facts in order. The old channel, the grade, the blockage points, the possible outlet location at the valley floor. She walked him through her calculations. She showed him the notes from the 1882 geological expedition and explained why the ravine system, while unstable in places, was manageable with the right approach. Caleb didn't interrupt. He leaned forward and looked at the map while she talked, and she could see him actually reading it, actually following the lines with his eyes, not just waiting for her to finish. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment. Where's the primary blockage? He asked. She pointed to it on the map. I know that ravine, he said. I've ridden past it, wrote it off as impassable. Most people do. The entry point is bad. But if you go around the south face instead of trying the direct approach, the terrain is manageable for about 200 yards in. The collapse is local. It's not the whole channel. Another silence. He looked at the map, then at her. How certain are you? He asked. About the grade and the channel capacity. Certain. About the terrain conditions. Reasonably certain, with the caveat that I haven't been inside the ravine itself. I've only surveyed from the outside. She met his eyes. I'd want someone who knows the land better to confirm the terrain assessment before committing resources. He nodded slowly. That someone being me. You know this county better than anyone else I've found worth talking to about it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the map. "This would require a crew," he said. "Equipment. Time we may not have if the drought breaks the wrong way this summer." "I know. And if I came to the Ranchers Association with this, they'd want to know where it came from." "I know that too," Rosalie said. A pause. Around them, the restaurant continued its quieter-than-usual conversations. Somewhere at a table near the front, Rosalie could see Dolores Fitch watching them with the kind of careful attention that would be reported to Mabel Crane by morning. "Let me look at the geological notes," Caleb said. She slid them across to him. He read them while they ate, really read them, not performing reading, and asked 2 more questions about the grade calculation that were good questions, questions that showed he'd understood the math. By the time the evening was done, they had not solved the drought, had not convinced anyone of anything, had not built anything at all. But walking back through the dark main street afterward, Rosalie was aware of something she hadn't felt in 6 years in Red Hollow, which was the particular sensation of being seen by someone who was actually paying attention. She didn't trust it yet. She'd learned not to trust things too fast. But she noticed it. And Caleb Mercer, walking back to the livery to retrieve his horse, was thinking about the grade calculation she'd done, and about the ravine he'd ridden past twice and dismissed, and about the fact that in 14 years of running the Mercer Ranch, he had never once looked at that terrain and thought, channel. He'd been looking for the wrong thing. Maybe, he thought, he'd been doing that in more than one direction. The talk started by Monday morning. It came in the form it always came in Red Hollow. Not direct confrontation, which would have required a kind of honesty the town hadn't yet developed, but in the subtler currency of looks and omissions and small adjustments to social arrangements. The women who usually nodded to Rosalie when she went to the general store nodded slightly less warmly. A family whose children's clothing she'd been altering for 3 years suddenly found another seamstress. The whisper network that ran through the women's social circles of Red Hollow had gotten to work, and its product was the slow withdrawal of the kind of ambient acceptance Rosalie had never been given directly, but had never had entirely revoked before. She went about her week. She had work to do and a water channel to think about, and she was not going to give Red Hollow the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Caleb came back to her shop on Friday. He'd ridden out to the ravine section on Thursday, he said. He'd gone around the south face the way she'd described. He'd found the channel entrance under about 3 feet of debris and downed timber. "It's there," he said. "The structure is intact where I could see it. You're right about the terrain being manageable from that approach." He paused. "I don't know yet about the upper blockage. I'd need to go deeper in to assess that." "When?" she asked. He looked at her. "Soon, before the summer gets further along." Another pause. "I'd want you there. You know the survey data better than anyone, and you'll need to see the terrain to confirm your calculations against what's actually there." Rosalie hadn't expected that. Most men, in her experience, took information she gave them and then went and used it without further reference to where it had come from. It was a pattern she'd encountered often enough that she'd stopped being surprised by it. "All right," she said. "Next Thursday, if the weather holds. I'll be ready." He nodded. Then, at the door, without turning back, "For what it's worth, Mabel Crane came to see me this week." Rosalie kept her face still. "Did she?" "She had some thoughts about the company I was keeping." A pause. "I told her I valued her opinion and would continue to make my own decisions. She left, probably to make some phone calls." "She doesn't have a telephone," Rosalie said. "Figure of speech." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you because I want you to know I heard what she said and didn't find it persuasive. Not because I need you to feel. I'm not trying to make you feel like I'm rescuing you from anything. I just want to be straight with you." Rosalie looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him and his hat in his hand and an expression that was uncomfortable with its own sincerity, which was somehow the most convincing thing about it. "I appreciate straight," she said. He put his hat back on and left. Rosalie stood at the work table for a long moment after. Then she went back to work. Outside, Red Hollow went about its business, suspicious and watchful, and firmly convinced that what was happening was a mistake that would become someone's lesson. It didn't know yet that it was the one about to learn something. Thursday came in gray and close, the sky the color of old tin, and Rosalie was outside her shop at 5:30 in the morning with her saddlebag packed and her map folded into the inner pocket of her riding coat before Caleb's horse had even rounded the corner of the main street. He pulled up and looked at her for a moment. "You've been up a while," he said. "I'm always up early." He didn't push it. She swung up onto Barton, the old roan gelding who had carried her across half of Nebraska and still moved with more stubbornness than grace. And they rode out of Red Hollow, in the quiet, before the town had decided to start watching. The ride to the ravine took most of an hour. They went east along the creek road, and then cut up into the foothills where the terrain started to roughen and the scrub pine came in dense and low. Rosalie had ridden this stretch 4 times now in her survey work, but always alone, always with an eye on the light, because she'd never wanted to be caught in the upper terrain after dark. With Caleb there, the ride felt different. Not easier exactly, but less like something she was doing in spite of the world. They didn't talk much on the way up. She wasn't a person who filled silence for its own sake, and apparently neither was he, which she filed away as relevant information. At the ravine entrance, she dismounted and studied the ground. "The debris field extends about 30 yards from the entry," she said. "After that, the channel walls stabilize. The down timber on the south face is the worst of it. See where that pine came down across the secondary wall? That's the piece that has to come out before you can assess the interior blockage." Caleb was already moving toward the wall, looking up at the angle of the fallen timber. He put his hand on it, testing the weight, tried it from 2 directions. "This came down recently," he said. "Not this season, but 3-4 years maybe. The rot's not deep." "That's consistent with the drainage pattern I mapped. The east runoff has been undermining that face since at least 1882 based on the geological notes." He looked at her. "You read those notes more than once." "I read them 6 times, she said. "I wanted to make sure I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see." Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, more like a kind of recognition. He turned back to the timber. "I'll need a 2-man crew minimum to move this," he said. "Probably 3 to be safe. And to come along, because we can't get a draft horse into this angle." "How long?" "Half a day if nothing goes wrong." He paused. "Things usually go wrong." "I know." They spent another 2 hours in the ravine, working their way in as far as the debris allowed, with Rosalie calling out measurements and Caleb checking the channel walls, and the 2 of them building up a picture of the obstruction that was more detailed and more complicated than either of them had hoped. The interior blockage was real, a collapse about 40 yards in where the channel roof had partially come down. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was more than a half-day job. It was a week's work with a real crew, maybe more, and it would need to happen fast if it was going to do any good before the drought took the summer. On the way back down, picking their way through the pine scrub, Caleb said, "I want to bring this to the Ranchers Association." Rosalie looked at him. "The meeting's in 2 weeks," he said. "If I can show them the survey data and the site assessment, and if I explain the timeline, I think there are enough men in that room who are scared enough about the water situation to listen." "What are you going to tell them about where the information came from?" "The truth." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Barton picked his way carefully over a loose stretch of rock, and she let him find his own footing. "They won't like it," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "Some of them won't. Harlan Fitch won't touch anything with my name on it. He's been looking for a reason to tell you you've made a mistake since I started talking to you," Caleb said. "Yes, I know." A pause. "Harlan Fitch has been looking for reasons to be right about things for 30 years. I don't intend to organize my decisions around what makes that easier for him." The directness of it, the simple, practical refusal to dress it up, was more effective than any reassurance would have been. They came out of the foothills onto the flat road, and Red Hollow was visible in the distance, low and brown against the pale sky. "I'll draft the survey summary tonight," Rosalie said. "If you want to present it, you'll need it in a form the association can follow without knowing the background. I can write it so it reads as straightforward ranching data." "That's exactly what it is," Caleb said. "I know, but the way you present things matters." He glanced at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it since before I had anyone to present it to," she said. "I wasn't just going to sit on it forever. I was trying to figure out the right approach." He didn't say anything for a moment. Why didn't you go to the association yourself? The question was asked evenly, without judgment, and that was the only reason she answered it honestly. Because I know what would happen, she said. A woman with a shop on the east side walks into a Ranchers Association meeting with a water channel proposal and a stack of survey notes, and the first question they ask is, who told her she could be there? By the time I've finished explaining that I taught myself surveying from borrowed textbooks, half the room has already decided the numbers are wrong. She paused. I've been in enough rooms to know which fights I can win and which ones I need a different approach for. Caleb was quiet for a stretch of road. That's not right, he said. No, Rosalie agreed. It's not, but it's accurate. She wrote the survey summary that night, working by lamplight until past midnight, drafting and revising until the language was clean and precise and free of anything that would let someone dismiss it on technical grounds. She knew how to do this. She'd done versions of it her whole adult life, making the work so undeniably correct that the person receiving it would have to argue with the math instead of with her. She delivered it to Caleb's ranch the next morning. His ranch hand, a young man named Cord, who had clearly been told to expect her and still looked slightly uncertain about how to behave, took it inside without comment and came back to say Mr. Mercer would read it that afternoon. She rode back to town. At the general store, she ran into Dolores Fitch. Dolores was a few years older than Mabel and had a different technique. Where Mabel went for the pleasant directness of a woman confident in her position, Dolores worked in the longer game. She smiled at Rosalie and said, "You've been busy," with a warmth that was mostly genuine and therefore harder to navigate than open hostility. "Always something to do," Rosalie said, reaching past her for the flower. "I heard you rode out to the foothills with Caleb Thursday morning." Dolores said it conversationally, like a woman reporting the weather. "Early start." "Survey work?" Rosalie said. Dolores picked up a tin of something and looked at the label. "He's a good man, Caleb. He has a lot of loyalty to this county, to the people who've been here a long time." A pause. "He'll need someone who understands that. The kind of standing he has here, you can't build that in a few years. It takes roots." Rosalie set the flower on the counter and looked at Dolores. "Are you saying I don't have roots?" she asked. "I'm saying..." Dolores smiled, the careful smile. "Some things take time. That's all." "I've been here 6 years," Rosalie said. "That's longer than 3 of the ranching families currently on the association roster. I don't know what you want me to tell you." Dolores's smile stayed in place, but something behind it cooled. "I just think you should be realistic." "I'm very realistic," Rosalie said. "That's actually one of my better qualities." She paid for the flower and left. Outside, she walked back toward the shop, with the familiar pressure in her chest and the familiar exercise of keeping it out of her face, and she thought about Dolores Fitch with her careful smile and her word roots, which was doing a lot of work in that sentence, carrying things Dolores hadn't said directly and didn't need to because everyone in Red Hollow already understood the freight. She went back to the shop and put the flower away, and got back to work. The sabotage started small. First, it was the order she'd placed with the freight supplier. Fabric she'd ordered in March that was supposed to arrive by the end of May. When it didn't come, she wrote to the supplier and got back a letter saying the order had been canceled at the end of April by a written request bearing her name. She hadn't canceled it. She didn't know the word forged yet because she couldn't prove it, but she knew what hadn't happened, which was her canceling anything. The replacement order cost her more because the spring prices had gone up. Then there was the matter of the Henderson family, who had been bringing her their mending for 3 years, and whose daughter had 3 dresses that Rosalie was supposed to be altering for the summer season. Mrs. Henderson came by the shop with a look that was uncomfortable in a specific way, the look of someone delivering a message they'd been given by someone else, and said that she'd decided to make other arrangements. She was sorry. Rosalie said that was fine and meant it because she could tell from the way Mrs. Henderson held herself that this decision hadn't been entirely Mrs. Henderson's idea. She lost 2 more regular clients in the following week in the same way, the same uncomfortable looks, the same slightly rehearsed apologies. She knew what was happening, she just couldn't prove any particular thread of it. What she could do was what she'd always done, which was absorb the impact without letting it change her direction and watch carefully for the places where the threads were visible. Caleb came to find her on the Wednesday before the association meeting. He'd read the survey summary, he said, and it was exactly what was needed. He'd also shared it carefully with two men in the association he trusted: Pete Alderman, who ran the largest operation in the North Valley and was generally considered the voice of reason in that room, and Sam Greer, who was younger and had been asking questions about the water situation for months without getting good answers. "Alderman wants to meet with you," Caleb said. Rosalie set down the coat she'd been working on. "Before the meeting?" "Yes, he wants to go through the numbers himself. He said—" Caleb paused with the slight discomfort of someone choosing words carefully. He said he'd rather ask his questions privately than in the room, which meant he had doubts and didn't want to air them in front of the others, which was actually the correct instinct. A man who asked his questions privately before the meeting and then endorsed the proposal publicly was worth more than a man who went in cold and made his skepticism part of the public record. "When?" she said. "Friday afternoon, if you can manage it." "I can manage it." She went to Pete Alderman's house on Friday with her survey notes and her calculations and her copied geological documents, and she spent 2 hours at his kitchen table going through everything with a man who had sharp eyes and no patience for gaps in logic. He asked hard questions. She answered them. When the numbers didn't immediately satisfy him, she showed him the source documents and walked him through the reasoning step by step without defensiveness. Because defensiveness was a luxury she couldn't afford, and also because the math was right, and she knew it. At the end of the 2 hours, Alderman sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked. "I taught myself," she said. "Started with a surveying manual and went from there." He looked at the papers on the table. "The grade calculation on the lower section is conservative," she said. "I ran it at the minimum expected snowpack. In a normal year, the flow would be higher. So your projected water delivery to the valley floor could be greater than what you've shown here." "Yes, I didn't want to oversell it." Another silence. Alderman looked at the map one more time. "I'll back it at the meeting," he said. "I want it on record that I'm doing that because the numbers are sound, not because Caleb asked me to." "I understand," Rosalie said. "That's the right way to do it." He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. Not warmth, not apology for how she'd been treated, just a clear-eyed acknowledgement that she'd done the work and the work was good. She rode back to town in the late afternoon with the sun behind her, and she let herself feel, for exactly the length of that ride, something she didn't usually allow herself, which was hope. Not confidence, not certainty. Those required more ground than she had yet. But hope. The actual kind. The kind with weight to it. The kind that feels like a hand on the back of your shoulder instead of a kite string in the wind. She put it away when she got back to the shop. There was still work to do. The association meeting was set for a Monday evening in the back room of Hartley's restaurant, which was the largest private meeting space in Red Hollow, and which smelled of old cigars and beeswax and the particular combination of tension and ambition that collected in rooms where men made decisions about land and water. Rosalie was not invited to the meeting. This had been discussed. Caleb had wanted her there. Alderman had said carefully that her presence would make the room more difficult to manage. Not because he thought she should be excluded, but because several men in that room would spend more energy resisting the fact of her than listening to the proposal, and the proposal was too important to risk on a symbolic fight they could save for later. Caleb hadn't liked it. Rosalie had told him Alderman was right. So she waited in her shop. She had a lamp lit and a coat to finish, and she worked on the coat with the steady mechanical focus that she'd learned to use when she needed to keep her hands doing something while her mind was elsewhere. The meeting was supposed to take 2 hours. She worked on the coat. She listened to the street sounds outside settle into the quiet of a Monday evening in a small frontier town. The occasional horse, the distant sound of Hartley's front door. At around 9:30, Caleb came to her window. She opened the shop door. He came inside and stood in the lamplight with his hat in his hand, and she couldn't read his expression yet because he wore difficult news and good news with similar care. "Alderman backed it," he said. "Greer backed it. We got a vote." She let out a breath she'd been holding without noticing. Who voted against? She asked. Harlan Fitch, two others who follow Fitch. He paused. Mabel Crane's ranch foreman was at the meeting as proxy, and he abstained. Abstained, Rosalie said, which is better than no. He came further into the room. We have the association's backing for a work crew and equipment. We're looking at starting the channel work in 3 weeks, contingent on the terrain assessment holding up. 3 weeks. That was tight, given the way the drought was moving, but it was something. There's something else, Caleb said. She looked at him. Harlan made a speech before the vote. He said some things about where the proposal came from, about your qualifications, about what he called the influence behind it. He stopped. I'm not going to repeat most of it. I told him in front of that room that the survey work was sound and that the source didn't change the math, and Alderman backed that up. But he said it, Rosalie said. He said it. She nodded once. She was tired, suddenly, in the specific bone-level way that came not from physical work, but from years of being the kind of person that rooms found inconvenient. What did you say? Specifically. Caleb looked at her. I said that I'd reviewed every calculation in that proposal and that I'd seen the channel myself, and that if anyone in that room wanted to reject sound water management on the basis of who did the math, they were welcome to dry out with their cattle and explain to their families why. A beat. And then Alderman called the vote. Rosalie stood in the lamplight of her small shop with the unfinished coat on the table behind her, and the map folded in her inner pocket where she'd put it that morning out of habit, and she looked at Caleb Mercer and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not gratitude, exactly. Or not only gratitude, something that had more weight than that. Something that had to do with not having expected it. You didn't have to go that far, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to. Outside, Red Hollow was quiet in the way it got on weekday nights, and the drought was still building over the hills to the east, and none of the things that needed doing were done yet. But the vote had passed, and Rosalie Boone's math was going to get its chance. 3 weeks turned into 2. The creek level dropped another 4 inches in the span of 7 days, and Pete Alderman rode into town on a Friday morning with the look of a man who had been watching numbers and didn't like where they were going. And he found Caleb at the feed store and said, flat and without preamble, "We need to move the timeline up." Caleb sent word to Rosalie that afternoon. She'd already come to the same conclusion. She'd been watching the creek herself. They moved the start date to Monday. The crew Caleb assembled was 6 men, 4 from his own ranch, including Cord, who was young but reliable with heavy equipment, and 2 hired men from the Alderman operation who knew the foothills terrain better than most. They had 2 come-alongs, a mule team for the heavy debris, a week's worth of provisions, and Rosalie's survey notes copied onto oilskin paper so they'd survive if the weather turned. Rosalie rode with them. There had been a brief conversation about this, or the beginning of one, and then Caleb had looked at her face and apparently decided the conversation wasn't necessary. You know the survey better than anyone, he said. You need to be there. Yes, she agreed. They rode out before dawn on Monday, 6 men and 1 woman and a mule team, and more uncertainty than any of them had said out loud. And Red Hollow watched them go from behind curtained windows and said nothing useful. The first 2 days at the ravine were the kind of work that stripped away everything except what was necessary. The downed timber on the south face had to come out first, and it was worse than it had looked on their initial survey. The root system of the fallen pine had taken a section of the secondary wall with it when it went down, which meant stabilizing the wall before anything else could happen. Cord spent most of the first day on his knees in the rubble, packing rock into the gap with a focus that Rosalie had not expected from someone his age. He didn't complain. None of them did, which told her something about the men Caleb chose to keep around him. Rosalie worked alongside them. She wasn't as strong as the hired men, and she knew it, and she wasn't trying to prove otherwise. She was there to read the terrain and keep the work aligned with the survey data, and she did that. She also carried timber, dug out debris with the same short-handled shovel everyone else was using, and made herself useful in the ways she could. By the end of the first day, her hands were wrecked and her back felt like someone had worked it over with a fence post. She didn't mention this to anyone. At the camp they'd set up at the ravine entrance, that first evening, Cord built a fire and someone produced a pot of coffee, and the men sat around it with the particular silence of people who have been physical all day and don't have words left. Caleb sat next to Rosalie on a fallen log and looked at her hands when she reached for the coffee cup. "You should wrap those," he said. "I know." She had cloth for it in her saddlebag. She'd been putting it off because it required admitting the hands were bad, which she hadn't wanted to do in front of the crew. "I'll get it," he said, and stood up before she could object. One of the hired men, an older one named Walt, who had a gray beard and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years reading terrain, watched Caleb walk back to the horses and then looked at Rosalie without particular expression. "You drew up the survey?" he asked. "Yes." "Pete Alderman says the grade calculation is sound." "It is." Walt nodded once, the nod of a man deciding something, and went back to his coffee. That was apparently the end of that conversation, and it was also, Rosalie understood, the closest thing to acceptance she was going to get from Walt in the near term, and she'd take it. Caleb came back with the cloth and wrapped her hands himself, which was more intimate than either of them had quite prepared for, and which neither of them commented on, and the fire burned down, and somewhere overhead the sky had gone fully dark, and the stars over the Wyoming high plains were the hard, specific stars of a place that doesn't have enough moisture in the air to soften them. The interior blockage was reached on the third day. It was worse than the exterior survey had suggested it might be. The roof collapse was about 60 yards in rather than 40, and the material that had come down was a combination of rock and compacted earth that was going to require more than a come-along and a mule. It was going to require blasting, or something close to it, which none of them had brought, and which would require going back to town for. Rosalie stood in the narrow channel passage, looking at the wall of debris, and felt the specific sick feeling of a calculation that has just been proven incomplete. "How far back do we go for supplies?" Caleb asked, standing beside her in the dim light. "To town. The freight supply has what we need: black powder and a proper drill set." She looked at the debris wall. 2 days round trip if someone rides hard." "Cord rides hard," Caleb said. Behind them, Walt was studying the ceiling of the channel passage with his squinting attention. "Before anyone rides anywhere," he said, without looking away from the ceiling, "you want to check the fracture line on the upper east wall. That's not just collapse debris, that's pressure." Rosalie turned. She looked where he was looking. He was right. There was a fault line running along the upper edge of the passage wall that her exterior survey hadn't caught, couldn't have caught, because you couldn't see it until you were inside. The collapse wasn't just old settling. There was active pressure from the hillside above, which meant that any blasting in this section needed to be precisely calibrated, or it would bring the whole passage down instead of clearing the blockage. "You've done channel work before," she said to Walt. "Irrigation, mostly. Southern Territory, 15 years ago." He looked at her for the first time since they'd entered the passage. "You need a shaped charge, not a general blast. You want to direct the force forward, not up." "I know what a shaped charge is," she said. "Do you know how to set one?" "In theory." "In practice?" A pause. "Twice. Both times it worked." "Both times," Caleb repeated. "It's a small sample," Walt allowed, "but it's not nothing." Rosalie looked at the fracture line again. She ran the geometry in her head. The angle of the pressure, the direction they needed the debris to move, the force required versus the force that would trigger the unstable wall section. It was a narrow set of parameters, narrow but not impossible. "All right," she said. "Cord rides for supplies. We spend tomorrow mapping the fracture line properly so we know exactly where to set the charge." She paused. "And nobody goes back into this section until we know what we're working with." Chas. Cord left before dawn the next morning, and the rest of them spent the day doing what Rosalie had said, mapping the fracture line, measuring the pressure indicators, building up the picture they should have had before they started and didn't because the exterior survey couldn't give it to them. It was on that day, while they were working in the passage entrance, that the first sign of trouble from outside reached them. One of Caleb's men, a quiet ranch hand named Jeffers, who had been sent back down to the supply camp for rope, came back up the trail at midday with a look that said he'd encountered something he wasn't sure how to report. "There's men at the valley mouth," he said to Caleb. "3 of them. They were asking about the work up here. Caleb looked at him. Asking who? The camp cook. He told them we were doing survey and drainage work. They said they represented a property claim on the ravine section. A silence. Rosalie looked up from the fracture mapping she'd been doing. What property claim? That's what I don't know, Jeffers said. They had papers. Cook couldn't read the details, but they had a seal on them. Rosalie looked at Caleb. He had the flat expression he got when something had moved from a problem he understood to a problem he didn't yet. I'll go down, she said. We'll both go, Caleb said. The three men at the valley mouth were not rough-looking. That was the first thing. They were dressed in clean trail clothes, and they had a professional quality to them that was different from most trouble Rosalie had encountered, which had come from open hostility rather than organized paperwork. The man who appeared to speak for them was about 50, compact, with a mustache trimmed to a precise width. He introduced himself as an agent for something called the Western Territory Development Group, which Rosalie had never heard of, and produced a document claiming a mineral rights interest in the ravine section that predated the association's project authorization. Caleb read it. His jaw was set. Rosalie took the document from him and read it herself, slowly, from the beginning. The claim was dated 8 months ago. The seal was from the Territorial Land Office. The specific parcel described covered exactly the section of the ravine containing the interior blockage, not the channel above, not the valley floor below, but precisely the section they were trying to clear. This was filed 8 months ago, she said. That's correct, the agent said pleasantly. The land office in Red Hollow had no record of a mineral claim on this section when I was reviewing survey documents in March. The agent's expression didn't change. These things sometimes take time to appear in local records. The filing was made at the territorial level. Rosalie looked at him. She looked at the document again. Then she said, in an even voice, "Who holds this claim?" "The development group." "Who owns the development group?" A slight pause. "That's a matter of business privacy." She folded the document carefully and handed it back. "We'll be back in Red Hollow within the week," she said. "We'll be reviewing the territorial filing record directly." The agent smiled. "That's certainly your right." They rode back up the trail, and Caleb was quiet until they were out of earshot of the valley mouth. And then he said, in a tone that was controlled but barely, "That claim appeared out of nowhere." "Not nowhere," Rosalie said. "Someone filed it. Someone who knew about this project and knew which parcel to cover." She paused. "The association vote was 2 weeks ago. The filing is 8 months old. Either someone anticipated this project before we made it public, or that date is not accurate." "You think the document is false?" "I think the date is convenient," she said, "which is different from knowing it's false. I'd need to see the original filing at the territorial office to know for certain." Caleb rode for a moment in silence. "Harlan Fitch has contacts at the Territorial Land Office," he said. "I know he does. And Mabel Crane's late husband had mining interests through a holding company." Rosalie looked at him. "Did he?" "I didn't connect it before," Caleb said. "There was no reason to." He paused. "The Western Territory Development Group." "I'll need to trace the ownership," Rosalie said. "That requires the territorial records. Cord can check when he's in town for the supplies. I'll write down what he needs to look for." They reached the camp. The afternoon was going gray, the clouds thickening from the west in the way that sometimes meant weather and sometimes meant nothing. Rosalie wrote out the records request in the clear, exact language she'd learned to use when dealing with official documents, the language that made it harder to misunderstand or misfile, and gave it to Jeffers to hold until Cord came back. Then she went back to the fracture mapping, because the work didn't stop for complications. Cord returned on the evening of the second day with the supplies and something else, a look on his face when he came into the camp that made Rosalie set down what she was doing before he'd said a word. "I went to the Territorial Records Office like the note said," he told her, standing at the fire with his hat in his hand, still trail dusty. "Asked for the Western Territory Development Group filing." "And?" "The clerk said the filing was there, dated 8 months ago, like the document showed." He paused. "But when I asked to see the original ledger entry, she went to get it and came back looking. She said the ledger was checked out. by someone from the county commission. He looked at her. She wrote down the name, said I could have it. He handed her a slip of paper. Rosalie read the name on it. She read it twice. Then she looked at Caleb, who was standing across the fire from her, and she watched him read it, and she watched his expression go through something she could only describe as a man revising his understanding of a situation he'd thought he understood. The name on the paper was Harlan Fitch. Not a surprise exactly, but holding the paper and seeing it written down was different from suspecting it, and the difference had a specific quality: the weight of confirmation. The moment when a theory stops being a theory and becomes a fact you have to decide what to do with. He's trying to stop the project, Caleb said. He's trying to own the project, Rosalie said. There's a difference. If that mineral claim holds up, any water infrastructure through that ravine section requires his, or whoever's behind that group's, authorization, which means fees, which means control. Over the water supply. Over the water supply. The fire crackled. Around them the camp was quiet. The men had heard enough to know that something had shifted, but not enough to know what, and they had the prairie instinct of not asking questions that weren't yet ready to be answered. We keep working, Rosalie said. Caleb looked at her. We keep working, she repeated. We have the association's authorization, and we have the survey, and we have the legal right to drainage work on public land, which this section is regardless of any mineral claim, because water rights and mineral rights are separate instruments under territorial law. Someone who knew the law well might have known that. She paused. The claim may have been designed to delay, not to permanently block. Scare us off. Yes. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, can you argue that? The water rights versus mineral rights separation? I can write it, she said. I'll need to verify one statute, but I'm fairly certain I'm right. He looked at her across the fire, and there was something in his face that was past the careful quality he usually kept. Something more direct, more unguarded. Rosalie, he said, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as what it is, not as... He stopped. Try it again. You've been right about every piece of this from the beginning. The channel, the fracture, the claim. I'm not going to pretend I'm leading this and you're helping. We're doing this together, and I want that to be clear. She looked at him for a long moment. I hear it, she said. Good. She went back to the oilskin papers and started drafting the legal argument by firelight, her wrapped hands moving carefully across the page. And the Wyoming sky above the ravine was heavy with cloud now, the first real weather pressing in from the west. And somewhere down in Red Hollow, the people who had been trying to stop this were not yet finished. But neither, not by a long way, was she. The weather that had been pressing in from the west arrived the next morning without apology. It came as the kind of rain that doesn't build gradually, but simply appears, full and heavy, at 4 a.m, drumming on the canvas of the camp shelter with a sound like something trying to get in. Rosalie was already awake when it started. She'd been lying on her bedroll for an hour, running the water rights argument through her head the way she ran calculations, looking for the place where it didn't hold. And she lay there listening to the rain and thinking about the fracture line in the upper channel wall and what sustained water on the hillside above it would do to the pressure dynamics she'd mapped. The answer she arrived at was not reassuring. She got up, got her coat, and went to find Caleb. He was already outside, standing at the edge of the canvas overhang and looking up the trail toward the ravine entrance with the rain coming down around him. He heard her coming and didn't turn around. The fracture line, she said. I know, he said. If this keeps up for more than a few hours, the pressure on that upper wall section is going to change. We calculated the charge placement for dry conditions. So we wait for a dry window. Yes. She stood beside him and looked up the trail, which was already running with thin sheets of water between the rocks. The problem is the timeline. Every day we wait is another day the creek drops. Pick your bad option, Caleb said, which was not a cheerful assessment, but was accurate. They waited. The rain went on for 14 hours, heavy for the first 6, and then settling into a gray, persistent drizzle that coated everything and made the hillside trails shine like wet leather. The crew played cards and repaired equipment and said very little. Walt sat at the edge of the shelter and looked at the sky with the expression of a man who had opinions about weather but was keeping them to himself. Rosalie spent the day revising the charge placement calculations for wet ground conditions, which changed the pressure assumptions in ways that required starting the geometry from a different point. She'd been working from theory on the shape charge question, cross-referencing against a blasting manual that had been part of a lot she'd bought at an estate sale 5 years ago because she'd wanted the surveying book in the same lot and hadn't known what to do with the rest. She hadn't expected to ever need the blasting section. She was grateful now that she'd read it anyway, the way she was grateful for most of the things she'd read without a specific reason. By evening, she had a revised placement that she thought would work under wet conditions. She showed it to Walt. He looked at it for a long time. "The offset angle is different from what I've seen done before," he said. "The fracture line runs at an unusual angle. A standard placement would direct force into the fault. And your placement directs it how? Perpendicular to the fault line, into the debris mass. The idea is to move the blockage forward without loading the wall." She paused. "It should work." "Should," Walt said. "Yes, should. I won't tell you it's certain because I don't know that it's certain. I know the geometry is right, and I know the calculation accounts for the wet ground. Whether the mountain does what we're asking it to do is between us and the mountain." Walt looked at the diagram again, then at her. "I've met men who knew less than this and were more confident about it," he said. "Mostly they made expensive mistakes." He handed the paper back. "The offset angle is right. I should have thought of it." That was the closest Walt had come to a compliment, and probably the closest he was going to get. The rain stopped before dawn on the second day, and by mid-morning the sky was cleared to a hard, cold blue, and Rosalie had the fracture line remeasured and the charge placement marked before noon. The actual setting of the charge was Walt's work, assisted by one of the hired men who had done some blasting on a railroad section years back and knew enough to be useful. Rosalie stood at the channel entrance and watched, and Caleb stood next to her, and the rest of the crew had pulled back to safe distance down the trail. It was quiet in the ravine, the kind of quiet that happens after rain in a narrow stone passage, everything dripping and still, the sounds of the tools carrying clearly in the cold air. "How long?" Caleb said. Walt said he'd need about an hour to set it properly. She looked at her watch. "He's been in there 40 minutes. And then we clear the entrance, and then we fire it, and either the blockage moves or something else happens." She paused. "I've been trying not to think too specifically about the something else." "That's probably healthy," Caleb said. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Walt came out of the passage at the 55-minute mark, moving at a pace that was neither hurried nor relaxed, the pace of a man who had done something that required attention and was now done with the part that required being in the passage. He walked to where they were standing and looked at Rosalie. "It's set," he said. "The fuse gives about 90 seconds once it's lit. You want everyone back to the secondary position." He looked up at the hillside. "The wall section I'm most concerned about is the upper east face. The fault runs further than your diagram shows. I could see it from inside. If the blast transfers to that section, how much further does it run?" Rosalie asked. "Maybe 20 feet. Hard to say from inside." He looked at her steadily. "The geometry should still direct force away from it, but I want you to know it's there." "I know it's there," she said. "It was on the original survey. I couldn't determine the full extent without being inside." Walt nodded once. Not reassurance, acknowledgement. The difference mattered. They pulled the crew back to the secondary position, a flat section of trail about 200 yards down from the ravine entrance, with a rock face on one side that would provide cover if the blast threw material further than expected. Rosalie crouched behind the rock face and looked up at the ravine entrance and thought about the offset angle and the fracture line and the 80% confidence she had in the calculation and the 20% she didn't. Caleb crouched next to her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air. "Whatever happens up there," he said, quietly enough that the crew behind them couldn't hear it, "I want you to know I don't regret any of this." She looked at him. "Not the dinner, not the association meeting, not any of it," he said. "Even if the mountain falls the wrong way." "The mountain is not going to fall the wrong way," she said, which was a statement of intent more than certainty, and he seemed to understand that. "Good," he said. Walt fired the charge. The sound was not the sharp crack Rosalie had expected from the blasting manual's description. It was deeper than that, more physical, a concussive pressure that she felt in her chest before she heard it fully, and then a rolling secondary sound as the debris inside the passage moved, and then, this was the part she'd been watching for, the hillside above the ravine. For 2 seconds it was still. Then the upper east face let go. Not the whole face, not the catastrophic failure she'd been calculating against, but the section Walt had pointed out, the extension of the fault line beyond her original survey, gave way in a rush of rock and wet earth that came down the outside of the ravine wall in a mass that was bigger than anything she'd planned for, that crossed the trail below the ravine entrance and kept going for another 30 yards down the slope, taking scrub pine and loose rock with it, filling the lower trail entirely. The noise of it went on for longer than felt right. When it stopped, the dust, what little there was with the wet ground, settled quickly in the cold air, and the ravine entrance was still standing, and the passage walls had held, and the secondary position where the crew was crouched had not been touched. Rosalie stood up slowly. Her legs were unsteady in a way that she noticed and decided not to acknowledge. "The passage is intact," Walt said, from somewhere to her left. He was already moving toward the entrance. "The external slide didn't compromise the wall." "The trail is gone," Cord said, looking at where the lower trail had been. "We'll rebuild it," Caleb said. He was standing, looking up at the ravine. He turned to Rosalie. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. It was mostly true. They went back up to the entrance and found that the interior blast had done what the geometry said it should do. The main debris mass had moved forward into the lower channel section, which was the open section that could be manually cleared. The blockage was not gone, but it was broken, and the internal structure of the channel above it was visible and intact. Walt stood inside the entrance looking at it with his squinting assessment. "It worked," he said. It was a flat statement. "The offset angle worked." "I know," Rosalie said. "You don't sound relieved." "I'll be relieved when the water's moving," she said. He sagged. The trail rebuild took the better part of a day, and the manual clearing of the broken debris inside the channel took another 2, and through all of it, Rosalie worked alongside the crew and watched the progress and revised the final outlet calculations based on what the interior survey could now show her, and tried not to think about what was waiting for them in Red Hollow. She thought about it anyway. On the last evening at the camp, with the channel work essentially complete and only the valley floor outlet left to construct back in the lower section, Caleb sat next to her at the fire and said, "Tell me what you're thinking." "About the claim," she said. "Yes. We have the water rights argument. It's solid. I've checked the statute twice, and I'm certain." She looked at the fire. "But Harlan Fitch has the territorial records in his hands, or he had them when Cord went to check. If he's altered the filing date, we need the original ledger entry to contest it, and if the ledger is in his control—" "He can't make a government ledger disappear," Caleb said. "No, but he can make it inconvenient to find for long enough to delay the project past the point of usefulness." She paused. "The drought won't wait for a legal process. What do we need?" "We need someone to go directly to the Territorial Commissioner's office with a formal written request citing the specific statute on water rights primacy, not the local land office, the commissioner level. That request creates an official record that can't be quietly buried." She looked at him. "And we need it filed before Fitch knows we're making it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Alderman has a contact at the commissioner's office. His brother-in-law clerks there. Can he be trusted?" "Alderman says yes." "I believe Alderman." Rosalie nodded slowly. "Then we need to get word to Alderman tonight. Cord can ride." Cord, when asked, said nothing except "all right," and had his horse saddled in 10 minutes. Rosalie wrote the request by firelight, precise and careful, the language of the statute woven into it so that anyone reading it would understand exactly what was being asked and on what grounds, and Cord rode out into the dark with it in his inner pocket. She watched him go. "There's something else," she said. Caleb looked at her. "The canceled order from my freight supplier," she said. "The clients I lost. Those things happened after the association vote, which means they happened after someone decided this project was worth stopping." She paused. "Someone who has connections to the supply routes and to the social network of this town." Mabel, Caleb said. Not a question. She has the supply connections through her late husband's freight interests. She has the social influence. She has the motive. Rosalie looked at her hands, the cloth wrapping that was fraying now at the edges. I can't prove it, but the pattern is there. Caleb was quiet for a longer stretch. When we get back, he said carefully, I want to look at the freight supplier cancellation letter. Why? Because I've been doing business with that supplier for 12 years, and I know his handwriting, and I know his letter format. He paused. If the cancellation request was forged in your name, the supplier's response letter might show inconsistencies in how the request was described. Rosalie looked at him. You're looking for the thread. I'm looking for the thread, he said. Because if Mabel Crane or anyone else forged your signature on a business document, that's not a social game anymore. That's fraud. The word sat between them in the firelight with its proper weight. We'll need more than one thread, Rosalie said. A forged letter alone is hard to prove without the original request document, which she wouldn't have kept. Maybe not the letter alone, Caleb said. But the supply manipulation, the mineral claim with the convenient date, the ledger that disappears when someone asks for it. Those aren't separate incidents. They're a pattern, and patterns can be documented. He said it the way she said things, plainly, in order, without dressing it up. She recognized the approach because it was her own, and the recognition of it in someone else did something to the tight, defended place she kept behind her sternum that she hadn't entirely expected. You've been thinking about this, she said. I've been thinking about it since the association meeting, he said. Since before that, maybe. He looked at her directly, the way he always did when he was saying something he meant. I'm not going to pretend I knew, walking into any of this, what it was going to become. The survey, the project, any of it. But I knew what I saw when I looked at you, and what I saw was someone who'd been doing things right for a long time in a place that was too busy being wrong to notice. A pause. That matters to me. Rosalie looked at the fire for a moment. You're not wrong about any of that, she said. And I appreciate it. But you should know that I'm not easy. I don't mean difficult in the usual way. I mean, I'm careful. I've been careful for a long time, and I don't know how to stop being careful just because something feels like it might be worth trusting. I'm not asking you to stop, he said. Being careful is how you built the survey and found the channel and got the math right when everyone else was looking the other direction. He paused. I'd rather have you careful and honest than certain and wrong. She looked at him. Outside the camp, the Wyoming night was wide and cold, and the cleared sky was full of the hard stars again, and somewhere down the valley the creek was still dropping, and the outlet work still needed to be done, and the legal battle in Red Hollow had barely started. But the channel was open, and the water was going to move, and Rosalie Boone, who had spent 6 years being the person Red Hollow looked through, was sitting at a fire in the Wyoming foothills with a man who had just said the most accurate thing about her that anyone had said in longer than she could clearly remember. And she was not going to cry about it because she was in a work camp with 6 other people, and also because she was who she was. But she felt it, all of it, the full complicated weight of being seen, imperfectly and incompletely, which is the only way anyone is ever actually seen. We should sleep, she said. The outlet work starts early. Yes, Caleb said. Neither of them moved for another few minutes. The fire burned down and the stars turned their slow arc overhead, and Red Hollow sat waiting in the valley below, full of its opinions and its schemes and its firmly held belief that it already knew how this story ended. It didn't know. It didn't know at all. The outlet work took one more day. It was the least dramatic piece of the whole project, clearing the valley floor terminus, shaping the final grade so the water would distribute into the irrigation channels rather than pool and run off, setting the stone and timber guide walls that would direct the flow during high-volume periods. Physical work, careful work, the kind that didn't have the weight of the blast decision or the charge placement or any of the moments that had felt like standing at the edge of something. It was just labor, honest and specific, and Rosalie found she was grateful for it. Her hands had mostly healed under the wrapping. Her back still complained going on day 8. She worked anyway. When the last guide wall was set and Rosalie had walked the grade one final time with her measuring rod and confirmed it was within acceptable tolerance, She stood at the valley floor terminus and looked up the long line of the channel toward the ravine and felt, for the first time since this had started, that a thing she had imagined was now a thing that existed in the world. It was a strange feeling. Not triumph. Not yet, because the water wasn't moving yet, and the legal fight wasn't finished, and Red Hollow was waiting down the road with all its opinions intact. But something quieter than triumph. The particular satisfaction of work that has been done correctly in conditions that were trying to prevent it. Caleb came to stand beside her. "Grades good?" he said. "Grades good." He looked up the channel line. "We open it from the upper section first. Let the flow find its level before we direct it to the distribution points." "Yes." "You want Walt to supervise the upper opening? He knows that section better than anyone now." "Already asked him." Caleb paused. "He said yes, and then said something about the offset angle that I think was a compliment." "From Walt, that's practically a speech," Rosalie said. They rode back to Red Hollow that afternoon. The crew strung out along the trail in the particular loose formation of people who are tired in the good way, tired from having finished something. The sun was going down ahead of them, red and wide over the flat plain, and the town appeared in the distance looking exactly as it always looked, low and brown and slightly unfinished. And Rosalie looked at it and felt the familiar tension of returning to a place that had decided what it thought of you before you'd had a chance to say anything. She rode in anyway. The water reached the valley floor 3 days later. It didn't arrive as a flood or a rush or anything cinematic. It came as a steady, increasing flow through the newly opened channel, quiet and purposeful, spreading into the distribution points that the lower valley ranchers had spent those 3 days preparing based on Rosalie's outlet specifications. By mid-morning of the third day after their return, the creek level had risen 2 inches. By afternoon, it was 4. Pete Alderman sent a rider to Rosalie's shop with a note that said, in its entirety, "The North Pasture tank is filling. Alderman." No additional commentary. She read it twice and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the alterations she'd been neglecting for 2 weeks. The town's response was not immediate. Red Hollow processed things the way it processed most things. Slowly, through the medium of conversation and recalibration, the gradual revision of the story it had been telling itself. In the first day there was surprise, in the second day there was relief, which people expressed mostly by not saying the things they'd been saying about the drought. By the third day, the relief had moved into something more complicated, the particular discomfort of a community that has been wrong about something in a way that has costs. The costs were real. Families who had spent the previous month trucking water in from 30 miles east had done so expensively and unnecessarily. The Henderson family, whose cattle had been showing stress on the depleted eastern range, would be able to move them back to the creek pastures now. The Greer Ranch's kitchen garden, which Sam Greer's wife had given up on in early June, could be replanted for a late season if they moved fast. All of this because of a channel that had existed in the terrain for longer than anyone in Red Hollow had been alive, waiting for someone to find it and do the math. The legal matter resolved itself in stages, and none of the stages were clean. Alderman's contact at the Territorial Commissioner's office, his brother-in-law, a meticulous man named Harrison, who apparently had strong opinions about proper filing procedure, received Rosalie's written request and acted on it within 48 hours. The formal review of the Western Territory Development Group's mineral claim against the Water Rights Primacy Statute was opened as an official proceeding, which meant it was now a matter of public record and couldn't be quietly redirected. Harrison also, on his own initiative, flagged an irregularity in the filing ledger that Harlan Fitch had checked out. When the ledger was returned, under official request it had to be, 2 entries showed evidence of alteration. The ink on the filing date for the development group claim was a slightly different composition from the surrounding entries, detectable under close examination. The original date, partially visible under the alteration, was not 8 months ago. It was 11 days ago, 4 days after the association vote. This information arrived in Red Hollow through the official proceeding record, which was a public document, and moved through the town with a speed that contrasted sharply with how slowly Red Hollow usually processed things. Because this was not an abstract piece of legal data. This was a specific thing that a specific person had done, documented in a government record, and it had implications that even the most charitable interpretation couldn't soften. Harlan Fitch did not make a public statement. He retained a lawyer from Cheyenne, which was itself a statement. Mabel Crane's connection to the development group took longer to establish, and came together in pieces that Caleb assembled with the systematic patience he brought to everything. The holding company structure was complex, 3 layers of incorporation designed to obscure ownership, but the original articles of incorporation for the development group listed a law firm that had also handled the estate of Mabel's late husband, and that firm had prepared a water rights acquisition memo 6 months ago on behalf of an unnamed client that described the Red Hollow Ravine section in specific terms. The memo surfaced through Harrison's official review when he cross-referenced the development group's filing history. The freight supplier cancellation came apart in the way Caleb had predicted. He went to the supplier himself, in person, and asked to see the written cancellation request that had come in Rosalie's name. The supplier had kept it. Suppliers kept things. And when Caleb put it next to a letter Rosalie had written to the same supplier in the fall, the handwriting was different in 12 specific places that Caleb marked in pencil and showed to the supplier without editorial comment. The supplier, who had no interest in being involved in fraud, wrote a sworn statement the same day. None of this was fast. None of it was without friction. The lawyer from Cheyenne filed 3 procedural motions that delayed the commissioner's review by 3 weeks. Mabel Crane's attorneys argued that the holding company connection was circumstantial, which it partly was, and that the water rights statute didn't clearly apply to the specific parcel in question, which required Rosalie to draft a 14-page legal analysis citing 11 separate territorial precedents that she worked on every night for a week, and which aldermen had reviewed by a proper lawyer who changed 2 paragraphs and said the rest was sound. What Rosalie understood through all of it was that justice in practice looked nothing like justice in principle. Justice in practice was 14 pages of citation and 3 procedural delays and a supplier's sworn statement that might or might not be enough, depending on which territorial judge was assigned to the case. It was slow and expensive and exhausting, and it required a tolerance for uncertainty that she had developed through long practice, but which still cost something every single day. It was also, imperfectly and incompletely, working. The commissioner's ruling came on a Tuesday morning in late August, delivered to the land office by territorial post and read publicly by the land office clerk, to a room that contained, among others, Pete Alderman, Sam Greer, Cord, the supplier, Caleb, and Rosalie. The mineral claim was invalidated. The altered filing date constituted fraudulent interference with public records, a finding referred to the territorial prosecutor. The Water Channel project was confirmed as legitimate infrastructure under the Water Rights Primacy Statute. The development group's interest in the ravine section was extinguished. Harlan Fitch was not in the room. Mabel Crane was not in the room. The room was quiet for a moment after the clerk finished reading. Then Alderman said, "Good," in the tone of a man closing a ledger. And that was mostly how it went. There was no celebration in the grand sense. Red Hollow wasn't built for grand senses. What there was instead was a gradual, awkward, town-sized reckoning that expressed itself in small ways over the following weeks. In the Henderson family returning their alteration work to Rosalie's shop without discussion of why they'd left. In Elsa Dunmore from the millinery stopping to talk to Rosalie on the street for the first time in months about something that had nothing to do with Caleb Mercer. In Sam Greer asking Rosalie at the general store if she'd consider consulting on a drainage project on his south pasture because he'd heard she knew about that kind of thing. Nobody apologized. That wasn't how Red Hollow worked. The apology was in the change of behavior, which was its own kind of inadequacy, but was also, Rosalie had come to understand, what was actually available. You could spend your energy being angry that people didn't say the words, or you could notice that the behavior had changed and do something useful with the fact. She chose the latter. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical than that, a decision to put her attention on what was in front of her rather than on the debt she was owed, which was real, but which no one was going to pay in the currency she'd originally wanted. This was the thing she'd learned, over years of being the wrong size in the wrong place doing the right work, that the world doesn't pay its debts in the form you want. It pays them in the form it has available, Sometimes that's recognition that comes too late. Sometimes it's a changed behavior from someone who never admits they were wrong. Sometimes it's just the water moving through a channel you built while people said it couldn't be done. You take what's actually offered, and you decide what to do with it. She and Caleb had a conversation about the future in October, when the first real cold had come in and the creek was running at normal levels for the first time in 2 years, and the valley below Red Hollow looked the way it was supposed to look going into winter, adequately watered, adequately prepared. They were at his ranch, at the kitchen table, which had become a place they met often now, working through whatever the current problem was, the outlet maintenance schedule, the association's new water management protocol that Rosalie was helping to draft, the question of what the Mercer Ranch's eastern range could support now that the water situation had changed. He asked her, in the middle of a conversation about the eastern range, if she would be willing to stay, not marry him. That came later, and it came awkwardly and imperfectly, and in the middle of an argument about fence line allocation that they had to finish before they could address the other thing, which was appropriate and also probably said something accurate about who they both were. But stay. Stay in Red Hollow, stay in the work they'd been building, stay in the thing that had developed between them through the survey notes and the ravine and the legal argument and 14 pages of territorial citation written by lamplight. "I'm not going anywhere," Rosalie said. "I know you're not going anywhere. I'm asking something more specific than that." She looked at him across the table. He had the discomfort of a man trying to say something important without the tools he wished he had for it, which was familiar to her because she felt that way constantly. "I know what you're asking," she said. And I'm not going anywhere," she said again, differently. He understood the difference. She could tell from the slight shift in his expression, the release of something held. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't what a story told a certain way would require at this moment. It was two people at a kitchen table who had been through enough together to know that what they were building was real, and who were both too careful and too honest to dress it up as something simpler or more certain than it was. They had work to do together. They had problems ahead they couldn't see yet. They had the particular difficulty of two stubborn, self-sufficient people learning to make room for someone else's way of seeing things, which was not a difficulty that resolved itself in a conversation or a season. None of that made it less than what it was. It made it more. The thing about Red Hollow, the thing that took Rosalie the full 6 years and then some to understand, was that the town wasn't cruel the way cruel people are cruel, intentionally and with satisfaction. It was indifferent in the way that most things are indifferent. It was busy with itself, organized around its own concerns, and it had a limited vocabulary for things that didn't fit its existing categories. Rosalie hadn't fit, so it had put her in the nearest available category, which was wrong, and had organized its behavior around that wrongness with the efficiency of a place that didn't have energy to spare for revision. What changed it wasn't a single moment. It wasn't the water coming through the channel or the commissioner's ruling or any of the dramatic points on the map of that summer. What changed it was the accumulation of evidence that its category was wrong, pressing against the category from enough directions that the category eventually gave way. People don't change their minds because they're shown they're wrong. They change their minds when the cost of staying wrong becomes too high to justify. Red Hollow had paid that cost in a drought that a woman it had dismissed had been working to solve for months before anyone else understood the shape of the problem. The payment was real, and it was public, and it was impossible to argue with. That was the mechanism. It wasn't noble. It wasn't the town discovering its conscience. It was a community arriving at a correct conclusion through the least graceful available route, which is how communities usually arrive at correct conclusions, and it counted. Rosalie counted it. By the following spring, she was sitting on the County Water Management Advisory Board, not because anyone had wanted to make a symbolic gesture, but because aldermen had said bluntly at an association meeting that they needed someone who knew the system better than anyone else, and there was exactly one person in the county who qualified. Harlan Fitch's land operation passed to a nephew who had neither his uncle's influence nor his uncle's inclinations. Mabel Crane sold her cattle interests and relocated to a larger city to the east, which Red Hollow noted and then moved past, because Red Hollow had always been better at moving past things than examining them. Rosalie's shop was still open. She still took in alterations and still kept the windows clean and the ledger balanced to the penny. The surveying notes and the water management work happened in the back room in the evenings, by lamplight, the same way they always had, except that now there was frequently a second horse tied outside. The channel ran through the summer and into the dry fall, and the following winter's snowpack fed it well, and the spring after that the valley's water situation was the best it had been in 20 years, which 3 people in Red Hollow connected publicly to the work that had been done in the ravine, and the rest connected privately and said other things about out loud. That was fine. Rosalie had learned over the long course of being who she was in the world that the most important things you do are rarely the things that get said about you correctly. The work is the work. The math is the math. The water moves or it doesn't, and the reasons it moves are written in the grade of the channel and the angle of the shape charge and the 14 pages of territorial citation, and those things are true regardless of what story the town decides to tell about them. She had built something real. It would last longer than the story. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, when she sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light before the ranch came fully awake, with the creek audible in the distance and the eastern hills turning gold with the first sun, and the work of the day laid out in front of her with its particular problems and its specific demands. It was, in all its imperfect and hard-won reality, exactly what she'd come to Red Hollow looking for. 6 years ago, without knowing that was what she was looking for. Not to be celebrated, not to be rescued, not to be given a place by someone else's hand, just to find ground solid enough to build on. She'd found it. The water was running, and Rosalie Boone, the woman Red Hollow had tried to look through, looked out at the morning and got to work.